Most people think they know where they stand financially. They glance at their bank app, see a few $1,000s sitting there, and feel either relieved or ashamed, depending on the number. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people never stop to consider. That number doesn't mean what you think it means. In fact, it might say far more about the country you live in than about you personally. Right now, the median balance in an American checking or savings account is roughly $8,000. Not 80,000, not a typo. 8,000, which means if you have more than that sitting in liquid cash, you're already ahead of half the country. Let that land for a moment. Half of American households have less than $8,000 available if something goes wrong. And yet, we're told the economy is strong. Markets are near record levels. Employment looks stable. Inflation, according to headlines, has cooled. So why does it feel like so many people are barely staying afloat? That disconnect isn't imagined. It shows up clearly once you stop looking at the glossy summary stats and start looking underneath. Over the last few years, I've spent time combing through Federal Reserve data, household finance surveys, and long-term consumer trends, and what they reveal is a very different version of the American economy than the one we're usually sold. On paper, things look fine. In practice, millions of people feel like they're treading water with weights tied to their ankles. One statistic alone explains a lot of the tension people feel. Roughly 2/3 of Americans report living paycheck to paycheck, and that group is far broader than many assume. This isn't limited to low-wage workers or people with unstable jobs. It includes professionals, dual-income households, people earning what would have been considered excellent money a decade ago. The pattern is the same. Income comes in, it's immediately absorbed by housing, transportation, food, insurance, and debt, and by the time the next paycheck arrives, the margin is gone. That's why calling this a personal finance problem misses the point. This isn't primarily about budgeting mistakes or bad habits. It looks much more like a structural squeeze. The cost of staying in place has risen faster than the rewards for working harder. And when that happens for long enough, it changes behavior, expectations, and psychology. It gets more fragile the deeper you look. A significant share of Americans have no emergency savings at all, not a small fund, not less than recommended. Literally nothing set aside. That means a car repair, a medical bill, or a short gap in income doesn't create inconvenience. It creates crisis. And again, this isn't because people don't understand the value of saving. It's because for many households, there is nothing left to save once essentials are covered. Retirement planning tells a similar story. More than half of households have no dedicated retirement savings. That doesn't mean they've chosen a different strategy. It means the future has been postponed indefinitely because the present demands everything. You can't prioritize decades from now when next month already feels uncertain. Inflation plays a quiet but central role in all of this. While the pace of inflation has slowed compared to its peak, prices themselves never came back down. Over a relatively short span of time, the cost of everyday goods and services rose dramatically. Food, housing, insurance, utilities, transportation, the basics, all reset higher. Wages did rise, but unevenly and generally not by the same magnitude. The result is a persistent gap between what life costs and what work pays. That gap doesn't make headlines, but it shapes daily decisions. This helps explain something else that's easy to dismiss, but hard to ignore once you see it. Consumer confidence around personal finances has weakened, even during periods when economic indicators look positive. A growing share of people expect their financial situation to get worse, not better. That pessimism isn't irrational. It reflects lived experience. When every year feels tighter than the last, optimism becomes harder to justify. There's also a growing divide between those who own assets and those who rely primarily on wages. If you owned stocks or real estate during strong market years, your net worth may have grown on paper. But paper gains don't help much if you're trying to pay rent or groceries with income alone. This split-screen economy creates the illusion that everyone is doing well, while a large portion of the population quietly falls behind. When people are asked what it would take to feel financially secure, the numbers they mention are strikingly high. Not luxury-level rich, just secure. The idea of needing 7 figures to retire comfortably or feel safe says less about greed and more about anxiety. It reflects uncertainty about healthcare costs, longevity, inflation, and the reliability of social safety nets. People aren't dreaming of yachts, they're trying to price peace of mind. This is where averages become misleading. You'll often hear that Americans have a certain amount saved by a certain age, but averages are pulled upward by a relatively small group at the top. Medians tell a much more grounded story. When you look at typical retirement balances by age group, the numbers are far lower than most people expect. Even near retirement age, many households have savings that would generate only modest monthly income if drawn down conservatively. That doesn't mean people have failed. It means the system has made it difficult to accumulate margin. Social Security plays an important role for many retirees, but it was never designed to replace full income on its own. When savings are thin and fixed costs remain high, even small disruptions can have outsized effects. Debt compounds the pressure. Younger adults often carry education and vehicle debt into their early working years. Midlife households tend to take on mortgages, family expenses, and lingering loans all at once. Older generations may still hold debt they expected to have paid off by now. None of this is inherently reckless. It reflects the rising cost of participating in modern life. Credit cards, in particular, often function less as discretionary spending tools and more as shock absorbers, filling the gap between income and expenses. High interest rates then quietly drain future income, reinforcing the cycle. Behavior adapts under pressure. When money feels scarce, people optimize for short-term survival rather than long-term growth. Savings rates fall. Risk tolerance shrinks. Decisions become reactive. This isn't a moral failure. It's a predictable response to prolonged financial stress. Housing is perhaps the clearest example of this tension. Renters face rising costs with little control, often devoting a large share of income to housing alone. Homeowners may have more stability, but they also face higher taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs than in the past. Either way, shelter consumes a growing portion of household budgets, leaving less flexibility everywhere else. What all of this adds up to is a quiet reshaping of expectations. The old benchmarks of financial success feel increasingly out of reach, not because people are doing nothing, but because the ground beneath them has shifted. Understanding where you actually stand requires context, not comparison to inflated averages or curated success stories. The goal of looking at these numbers isn't to provoke fear or despair. It's to replace confusion with clarity. When people feel like they're struggling in an economy that's supposedly thriving, it creates shame and self-doubt. The data suggests a different explanation. Many households aren't failing. They're navigating an environment that has become far less forgiving. Once you see that clearly, the conversation changes. It moves away from blame and toward understanding the forces at work. And that understanding is the first step toward making sense of your own position in a system that often feels stacked, opaque, and exhausting. If you bought a home sometime in the last few years, there's a quiet realization that probably hit you after the paperwork was signed and the first few mortgage payments cleared. The house itself might be fine. The neighborhood might be fine. But the payment feels heavy, not emotionally heavy, structurally heavy. The kind of heavy that shows up every single month and refuses to be ignored. Most recent buyers are locked into mortgage rates that would have sounded absurd just a few years ago. What used to be considered high is now normal, and when you run the numbers, the reality gets sobering very quickly. A home that looks reasonable on paper can turn into a monthly obligation that dominates an entire household budget. By the time you layer in taxes, insurance, and the endless little costs of ownership that never make it into the listing price, housing stops feeling like a stepping stone and starts feeling like a gravity well. For a household earning what most people would still call good money, it's entirely possible for housing alone to absorb close to half of what actually lands in the bank each month. Not lifestyle inflation, not luxury spending, just shelter. And that's before groceries, utilities, transportation, healthcare, or childcare enter the picture. Here's where the story takes a strange turn. If you already owned a home before rates and prices surged, your financial picture might look incredible on paper. Home values jumped, investment accounts recovered and, in some cases, soared. Statements arrive telling a story of growth and progress. Net worth charts point sharply upward, and yet many of those same people still feel squeezed. The bills don't care about unrealized gains. The electric company doesn't accept home equity as payment. Paper wealth doesn't always translate into breathing room. This is the contradiction at the heart of the current economy. Asset values can rise at the same time that cash flow tightens. Both things can be true, and increasingly they are. Turn on financial news, and you'll hear about strong markets, resilient consumers, and solid growth. Talk to people off camera, and you hear something else entirely. Exhaustion, anxiety, and a constant sense of falling behind despite doing everything right. That gap between perception and lived experience is where a lot of the frustration comes from. It's also where debt quietly steps in to play a starring role. Credit cards, in particular, have become the connective tissue holding strained budgets together. Not as a tool for indulgence, but as a bridge between income and expenses that no longer line up. On the surface, an average balance might not sound catastrophic, but interest changes the story completely. When balances carry over month after month at rates that would have once been unthinkable, time becomes the enemy. What starts as a temporary solution stretches into years. The purchase is long forgotten, but the payment remains. This isn't accidental. The system is designed around minimums that feel manageable while quietly maximizing interest over time. The psychology behind it is ruthless, but understandable. Financial stress narrows attention. When you're juggling work, family, and rising costs, precision tracking gives way to survival mode. The card gets swiped with the promise that it'll be dealt with later. Later keeps moving. Eventually, interest becomes just another bill, normalized and accepted, even though it's one of the most expensive forms of borrowing available. Debt doesn't just drain money, it drains optionality. It limits the ability to respond to opportunities or setbacks. A household carrying multiple forms of debt might be doing fine on the surface, paying everything on time, appearing stable. But under the hood, a large share of income is already spoken for before it ever arrives. That leaves very little room to save, invest, or even absorb a modest shock without adding more debt. This is why emergency funds feel out of reach for so many people. It's not a lack of discipline, it's arithmetic. When fixed obligations rise faster than income, the margin disappears. And margin is everything. Margin is what turns income into security instead of just survival. Zooming out, this isn't a short-term phenomenon. When wages are adjusted for inflation, growth over the past couple of decades has been modest for a large portion of the workforce. At the same time, the costs that are hardest to avoid, housing, healthcare, education, childcare, have consistently risen faster. Even people earning more in nominal terms than their parents did at the same age often find they can afford less. The money is bigger, the purchasing power is not. That disconnect explains why so many people feel like they're being told a story that doesn't match their reality. From a macro perspective, the economy can look healthy. From a household perspective, it can feel punishing, especially for those who don't own appreciating assets or who entered the market late, after prices reset higher. Housing is a perfect example of this divide. Renters face rising costs with little insulation and no upside beyond stability, and even that is fragile. Homeowners who locked in low rates years ago are reluctant to move, not because they love their house, but because leaving would mean re-entering the market under far harsher terms. The home becomes less of a flexible asset and more of a constraint, comfortable perhaps, but restrictive. A kind of golden cage. As a result, mobility declines. People stay put longer, not always by choice. That has ripple effects across labor markets, family decisions, and long-term planning. When moving costs more than staying, even if staying isn't ideal, people adapt. But adaptation isn't the same as progress. The wealth gap widens in subtle ways. Those who owned assets before the surge benefit from appreciation. Those trying to get in later face higher prices, higher rates, and higher barriers. The starting line moves further away, even as the race continues. It's not that effort no longer matters. It's that timing matters more than most people were ever told. What makes this especially difficult is that many of the benchmarks people compare themselves to aren't goals. They're medians. They represent the middle of a distribution, not a comfortable endpoint. Being ahead of the median can still mean being unprepared for the future. Being behind it can feel like failure, even when the system itself makes catching up extraordinarily difficult. When people talk about needing large sums to feel secure or retire comfortably, it's easy to dismiss that as unrealistic or pessimistic. But those numbers are often expressions of uncertainty rather than ambition. They reflect fears about longevity, healthcare costs, inflation, and the reliability of income in later years. They're less about luxury and more about avoiding vulnerability. The uncomfortable reality is that many people, at current savings rates and cost structures, may never reach those perceived targets. That doesn't mean they've done something wrong. It suggests that the economic model rewards ownership and scale far more than steady labor. Profit flows upward more efficiently than stability flows outward. Still, there's an important distinction to make here. Structural pressure doesn't mean individual agency disappears. It does mean expectations need recalibration. Comparing yourself to distorted averages or highlight real success stories only adds psychological weight without adding clarity. What actually matters, especially in an environment like this, is margin. The gap between what comes in and what goes out. That gap might be small. It might feel almost insulting to focus on. But it's the only part of the equation that compounds in your favor. It's the buffer that turns setbacks into inconveniences instead of crises. Progress under these conditions is rarely dramatic. It's incremental. It's uneven. It doesn't make for great headlines, but it's real. Having something saved, even if it's modest, already puts you ahead of a significant portion of households. Reducing high-cost debt, even slowly, changes the trajectory more than it feels like in the moment. The broader system may be extractive. The environment may be unforgiving. None of that changes overnight. But understanding the forces at play matters. It reframes the story from personal failure to structural challenge. And that reframing is powerful. It replaces shame with strategy and comparison with context. You're not competing against people who benefited from perfect timing or inherited advantages. You're not racing a chart on a screen. You're building stability in an economy that makes stability expensive. That's not weakness, that's reality. And recognizing it is the first step toward navigating it with clarity instead of self-blame.